All right, so get ready, because today we're going to do a deep dive into
Ooh, spooky.
a truly creepy tale.
Okay, I like it.
Yeah. It's a personal account of a potentially haunted apartment. So we're going to kind of go through all the details and try to make sense of it all. What do you think? Is there like a logical explanation for all this spooky stuff? Or are we dealing with something,
Paranormal.
paranormal?
I mean, what we've got here is a first-hand account, which always makes things more, like, exciting, you know?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's like we're stepping right into their shoes.
Exactly. And this account titled Haunted Apartment, like, it really doesn't hold back on the chills. Like, the resident is talking about footsteps on the ceiling, a bed shaking violently, and even a door that slams shut. It's like it's textbook haunting.
Right.
Yeah.
Ooh, let's set the scene. Okay, so this apartment complex,
Hmm.
built sometime in the 70s or 80s, located on what used to be Native American territory, an area known for
Oh.
a history of skirmishes and death, unfortunately.
Okay, so you don't hear like 70s apartment building and think like, oh, that must be haunted.
Right.
But then you add that layer of history,
Well, yeah.
and it's like, okay, there might be something to this, right?
For sure. It adds a lot of complexity to it. Definitely something to keep in mind as we go through the story.
Totally. So at first, the resident, he's living in like a different unit in the complex,
Oh,
dealing
wow.
with typical apartment problems, mice,
Oh,
roaches,
yeah, I've been there.
the usual.
Yeah, the usual.
But then he gets a top floor corner unit. He figures it'll be quieter,
Oh, nice.
with fewer neighbors,
Makes sense.
less hassle.
Peace and quiet.
Yeah, you'd think, right?
Okay.
But then that's when things get weird.
Here we go.
He and his partner, they start hearing footsteps right above them
What?
every single day.
But they're on the top floor.
Yeah. So, I mean, can you imagine hearing that day in and day out? Like, what would you think?
Oh, I'd be freaked out. Absolutely.
Mhm.
That's, like, unsettling. But it gets worse, right? Because it seems like these footsteps have a pattern.
Oh, no.
Yeah. The resident describes them as pacing in a circle, and then they settle, like, in the corner, almost as if someone or something is watching.
Okay. At this point, I'd be looking for a new apartment.
Yeah.
But, like, before we jump to conclusions, did he think it was like squirrels in the attic? I've heard some weird stuff in my attic before.
Yeah. He did explore that option, because the building does have a slanted roof, so he thought maybe someone was in the attic.
Right.
But he kind of dismissed that theory because it just didn't explain why anyone would be up there, let alone moving around like that in
Yeah.
that specific way.
That's fair. Okay, so what about noise from the neighbors below? Was that even possible? I mean, older buildings aren't exactly known for their,
Soundproofing.
yeah, soundproofing.
Right. He did consider that as well. But he was very specific in saying that the sound seemed to be coming from directly above them, not echoing from another unit. It's as if the sound was, like, originating in their apartment.
Okay, so he's ruled out all the obvious stuff. Like, what was his next thought? Did he start thinking ghosts?
Well, he did. And his reasoning is really interesting. He mentions having a gift of discernment.
Hold on. A gift of discernment. What is that?
Okay, so essentially he believes that he has a heightened sensitivity to the spiritual realm.
Okay.
He claims to see things, including, like, the truth in people. He can get glimpses into the past and future, even experience.
Remote viewing?
Yes, remote viewing.
Okay. So he's like already kind of thinking about all this paranormal stuff.
Right.
So that definitely adds another layer to how he's looking at these footsteps.
It's important to remember that's his background. So as we go into the rest of the story, keep that in mind.
Okay, so with that in mind, back to the story. What happens next?
So this gift of discernment, does it lead him to any conclusions about the source of the footsteps?
It does. He actually claims to have seen the entity that he believes is responsible for the footstep.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he describes a young, bearded man in flannel and jeans pacing upside down on the ceiling.
Okay, hold on. Pacing upside down on the ceiling.
Yes.
That is a visual.
Right?
Okay. It's interesting. He sees this figure pacing,
Yeah.
just like the footsteps.
Right.
Almost like the footsteps are a manifestation of the entity.
It's like the physical and the spiritual are like intersecting.
Right, okay. And this isn't just some guy freaking out, right? Like,
Right.
he almost became a priest at one point, was interested in exorcisms, even wanted to specialize in demonology, but chose family life instead.
So he's got experience,
He's bringing a lot of,
background.
background.
Right.
It really shows just how subjective these paranormal experiences can be, right?
Right.
What one person might, dismiss as an overactive imagination, someone else with different beliefs and experiences could see as evidence of something truly otherworldly.
You know, that's a great point. We all bring our own stuff to the table.
Exactly. And that could really shape how we see things.
Okay, so we have footsteps on the ceiling, we have a possible entity, and a resident with a gift of discernment. It already sounds like a horror movie.
It does. But the story doesn't end there.
Oh no.
This is just the beginning.
Footsteps are just the beginning. Okay.
So we left off with our resident seeing this shadowy figure pacing on his ceiling,
Yeah.
mirroring those unexplained footsteps.
Yeah.
I mean, that's creepy, right?
Yeah. It's like, okay, this is getting serious.
Yeah.
But before we like go full ghost hunters on this thing, let's take a step back. Are there any other explanations?
Sure. Of course, always got to approach these situations with a healthy dose of skepticism. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Got to rule out anything natural before we start talking about the paranormal, right?
Right. So what are some possible alternatives? Like, could there be like a scientific reason for all of
Now,
this?
there could be some older buildings, they could be prone to settling, shifts in their foundations,
Okay.
especially if they're built on land that's, well, less stable.
So you're thinking maybe a structural thing could be causing the noises and maybe even the shaking bed?
Possibly. Imagine like a slight tremor or a shift in the foundation. Just specifically affects the area above our resident's apartment. It wouldn't be noticeable to others in the building, but it could explain why it's just happening there, right?
Right. Well, wouldn't a tremor or a shift, wouldn't you notice that? Wouldn't stuff fall off the shelves, pictures come off the walls?
Not necessarily. If it's subtle enough, it might just manifest as vibrations
Mm-hmm.
or unsettling movements, in just specific spots. Not the most likely explanation, but we can't rule it out.
Okay. Fair enough. But let's say, just for argument's sake, that we are dealing with something paranormal. Like, what could explain all this?
Well, one possibility is that these are manifestations of residual energy. Remember, this apartment complex, built on land with a history of conflict and death, some people believe that those kinds of places can hold on to that energy, from past traumas and create a sort of echo.
So it's like the land itself is haunted by its past, and these events are like a reflection of that.
Right. And if we consider this entity he's describing, it's possible it's a manifestation of someone who died there, maybe a soldier or a settler, caught in one of those skirmishes.
Oh, that's interesting. It ties into that whole historical context we talked about earlier.
Right. And it raises the question, why is this energy or this entity, why is it focused on them?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is it just random? Or is there something about them that's like attracting this attention?
Well, the resident's gift, right? The gift of discernment, that could be a factor.
Okay.
Perhaps his heightened sensitivity makes him more susceptible. It's like he's tuned into a frequency that most people can't hear.
That's a cool way to put it.
But there's another event in this account that adds a whole new layer of complexity, the shaking bed.
Oh, yeah. That was creepy. Imagine just lying in bed, about to fall asleep, and suddenly...
The bed shaking violently.
Yeah. Stuff of nightmares.
Totally. And what makes it even more unsettling is that he couldn't explain it. He ruled out the obvious stuff like a passing train or even like a pinched nerve.
Okay.
He was adamant that this was something else.
So what did he do? Did he just like ride it out?
This is where his background really comes into play. He decides to pray.
Really?
Yeah, he believed the shaking was spiritual in nature.
So he's like fighting back.
Exactly. Prayer as protection.
Okay.
Now, whether it worked or not, we don't know. But the shaking did eventually stop.
Thank goodness. That's at least something.
It is. But
Okay.
it doesn't end there. And this is where things get really interesting with the timeline.
Okay, I'm all ears. What happened?
So that same night, right, when the resident was experiencing the shaking bed, his partner was at her grandmother's house, and she had her own encounter.
Oh no. Not at grandma's house too. Tell me this isn't some kind of like family curse situation.
Well, not quite a curse, but it's definitely unsettling. So she goes to her grandma's place, goes to her room, goes to open the door, and it's jammed, completely locked shut.
Okay, so we have two seemingly unrelated events happening at the same time. The shaking bed and the jammed door. Is it just a coincidence, or is there something connecting them?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And remember, the partner's grandmother had to come and force the door open. And she's described as wise and spiritually powerful.
Wait a second. So both the resident and his partner have family members who are deeply connected to, like, the spiritual stuff. It's
Yeah.
like this theme running through the story, right?
It does, doesn't it? Adds another layer of intrigue.
Okay, so we have a resident with a gift of discernment, an entity chilling on the ceiling, a shaking bed, a jammed door, and family members with spiritual connections. It's like we're in an episode of Supernatural.
Kind of right. But before we get lost in the paranormal, let's consider, could this be psychological?
Oh, like, is it possible that fear is, like, amplifying everything?
Exactly. When we're afraid, anxious, our senses get heightened, right? We might misinterpret ordinary things. It's fight or flight.
Right, right. Like when you're walking alone at night and suddenly every shadow is a monster.
Exactly. And in this case, his belief in the paranormal, plus the whole vibe of the apartment complex, the history, could be feeding into his fear and how he sees these events.
So it's like a loop. The more he believes, the more he sees paranormal stuff, the more he believes.
Exactly. Belief, perception, and suggestion. Powerful stuff.
But what about the partner's thing with the door? How does that fit in?
Maybe she was influenced by his anxiety. She'd heard about the bed, the entity, so maybe she was already on edge, and that made her see the door as something more than just a stuck lock.
Okay, that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
when you hear a scary story and suddenly you're hearing every little creak in your house.
We're incredibly suggestible. Our minds, they love to fill in the blanks, especially when we're ready to believe.
So we have, what, like two possible explanations here. One, scientific, tremors, shifts in the building, and the other, psychological, fear, suggestion, and then there's the whole, paranormal thing, an entity messing with them. It's like we're looking at this story through three different lenses.
That's a great way to put it. And it's up to each of us to decide, which lens, which combination of lenses works best for us.
It's like we're putting together a puzzle, but we don't know if we have all the pieces or if there are some missing pieces that would, like, change the whole picture.
Yeah, and sometimes we just have to accept that there may not be a definitive answer.
I guess that's part of the whole, allure of the paranormal, the mystery. Makes you question everything.
For sure. It reminds us that the world is a vast and complex place, full of wonders and mysteries that we may never fully understand.
I'm really curious what our listeners think. What lens works best for them? The scientific, the psychological, or the paranormal?
Me too. Hopefully this deep dive will get people talking
Sure.
and maybe even inspire them to share their own stories.
Speaking of perspectives, we haven't really talked about his gift, right? The gift of discernment. Could that be like the key to all of this?
Ooh, that's a good question. And one we'll explore in the final part of our dive.
Mhm.
We'll look at psychic abilities, the potential for misinterpretation, and the difficulty of proving these things.
Okay, I'm hooked. Stick around, folks. We're about to go even deeper into the mystery of the haunted apartment. We're back for the final part of our deep dive into the haunted apartment. So we've looked at the residents' experiences, we've tossed around some explanations, and we've even talked about, the possibility of a haunting. But there's one piece of the puzzle we haven't really dug into yet, that gift of discernment.
Yeah, we haven't fully explored that. It's a big one because it really shapes how the resident is seeing all of this. Remember, he believes he can see things others can't, sense energies that are hidden from most people.
Yeah.
It's like having an extra sense.
So how common is this gift of discernment? Is it something that, like, a lot of people believe in?
Well, beliefs about psychic abilities, they differ, depending on cultures and individuals. Some people are all in, some are skeptical. There's no real scientific consensus, but there are a lot of stories, personal experiences that suggest there might be more to our perception than we realize.
It's a fascinating topic, and it makes you wonder, if someone really believes they have this gift, wouldn't it affect how they experience the world?
Absolutely. It's like wearing a special pair of glasses that lets you see things others can't. But here's the thing. How do we know if it's real psychic perception or just like an overactive imagination? Or seeing patterns that aren't really there?
Right, right. It's like trying to figure out what's real and what's not in a ghost story.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so tricky. It's hard to prove or disprove these abilities. We can analyze the evidence, look for patterns, consider the person's credibility, but in the end, it often comes down to belief.
So how does all of this connect back to our resident and his haunted apartment? Could his gift be, like, making things worse or even creating them?
It's something to think about. If he truly believes he can see entities and sense energy, he might interpret normal things as paranormal. We talked about suggestion before, right? Our minds can fill in the blanks when we're primed to believe.
Oh, yeah, it's like those optical illusions. You see one thing and then your brain flips it and you see something totally different.
Exactly. So his belief, plus the creepy vibes of the apartment, the history, it could all be creating the perfect recipe for these paranormal experiences.
Okay, so his beliefs could be shaping what he sees and hears, but what about the physical stuff? The shaking bed, the jam door. Can his gift explain those too?
That's where it gets really complicated. Some people believe that psychic abilities can affect the physical world, but science hasn't backed that up. So, got to be careful, avoid jumping to conclusions.
So we're back to square one. Is there a rational explanation, or are we in the realm of the unexplained?
A question that's been around forever,
Huh.
right? And we might never have a definitive answer, but that's okay. Exploring the mysteries, questioning our assumptions, having these conversations, it's all part of the journey.
You know, it's funny you say mysteries. We've been talking about the haunted apartment and the resident, but what about the place itself? Could it be like a magnet for this stuff no matter who lives there?
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Remember, the complex is on Native American land with, a history of conflict and death.
Hmm.
And some people believe places like that become like infused with energy, almost like a spiritual vortex.
So it's like the land is haunted and the apartment building is just sitting on top of it.
Exactly. So anyone living there, especially someone sensitive like our resident, might be more likely to experience weird stuff.
Like the building is amplifying the energy that's already there.
Right. So the question is, if you take the resident out of the equation, would the weird stuff still happen?
That's a tough one. And kind of creepy to think about.
It really highlights how individual perception, the environment, and the paranormal all intertwine.
Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive. We've gone through the experiences, the explanations, the gift, and the history. I think the biggest takeaway is that when it comes to the paranormal, the truth is, well, it's complicated.
Totally. There's rarely one simple answer that works for everyone. And that's fine. Embracing the mystery, questioning what we think we know, having respectful conversations, that's what makes this stuff so interesting.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe some of our listeners have their own stories or thoughts about what's going on in that apartment.
We'd love to hear them. What parts of this story stick with you? What explanations make sense?
Yeah.
What would you do if you were in the resident's shoes?
Yeah. Would you stay and try to figure it out, or would you get out of there?
That's a choice that would challenge anyone. It reminds us that the world is full of mysteries, and sometimes the best stories are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.
So the next time you hear a weird noise or feel like you're not alone, think about this haunted apartment. It might just be a reminder that the line between what we know and what we don't is pretty thin, and that the world is full of amazing, mysterious things waiting to be explored. Thanks for listening.